All right. So we're item 18, correct? To change Madison Park master plan.
I just want to introduce this item very, very briefly and turn it over to Sarah, who's done the vast majority of the work on the plan from a staff perspective and led that effort. The plan for you tonight is the culmination of, as you all were, significant effort of resources, time and resources, engaging a variety of residents towards developing a long-term vision for the plan for one of Madison's iconic landmark community parks. It is the first community park that we've went through the process with the relatively recently adopted master planning process. That process provided a significant increased focus on engagement and listening to the community. And certainly, as a part of going through the first time using that process, we are continuing to, as we strive towards process improvement across our organization, seeing a lot of learning opportunities to improve that as we move into other parks. Most notably, Vilas is next on the list. The plan does strive to balance a variety of factors. Sarah will get into a lot of that. Certainly, a master plan is also something that should be viewed, in my estimation, as a document that guides the future development. It is not necessarily prescriptive in every aspect. And I will give you a quick example of how that works. We've had a master plan for Elder Park for 40 years. In 2011, there was a movement, kind of a foot in our community, really pushing for looking at splash parks. Splash parks weren't a known amenity 40 years ago. As we started looking at hearing from the community they wanted splash parks, we went through the process of where ought they to go, and once we know where they ought to go, then we amend the master plan, and now we have a splash park. Conversely, there are at least a dozen tennis courts that are unconstructed on master plans in our park system across the city. Those were master planned in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when tennis was very popular. Tennis is a little less popular than it used to be, so we don't build something that isn't meeting demand. And I wanted to kind of clarify that of how we look at it, or at least how I look at it at a staff level, and using master plans to build the future projects. I do also want to kind of make sure I frame how I see plausible actions tonight. There are a multitude you can take, but you can take or leave my three that I see as logical. One, you could approve the plan as presented certainly. Two, you could approve the plan with modifications to be finalized by staff and considered adoption. That is consistent with past master plans we have adopted here under the policy. I think Patriot Park was the most recent, where there's a modification of the trail moving a little. So you adopt the plan, we move it on the map, and we move forward. I would suggest that if those modifications are significant, we don't consider those as modifications. We really consider those moving into the phase 3 or third option, because small scale individualized items make sense to eliminate or don't eliminate those type of things. But when we start moving lots of boxes on master plans, we're really getting into the essence of planning. Those inherently require value judgments and trade-offs, and that I don't think there's any way this commission could possibly give us all the guidance necessary to make those changes, consider it adopted, and staff feel good about that situation. There's no set number, just kind of how I see that being potentially problematic. The last one is to place it on file without prejudice. That, to me, is an important motion to take here, because if the other two are not workable, I don't see referral into a future meeting, and a faraway future meeting is likely, given the current resources we have, given the direction I've received from the mayor and the council, who do direct me on what to do with the staff. I don't feel comfortable allocating staff resources to continue at this point in time. We are putting right now 2019 projects on hold to get where we are today. That's okay. There's a point at which we can't recover those projects, and I don't feel like I don't think that's fair to those projects. It doesn't mean the project couldn't come back. What I would ask at that point is some prioritization from the commission. If they think it's a 2020 thing, then we'll put it in the budget work plan and we'll bring it back. If it's further out, then further out. And certainly on that issue, there are some concerns around this current seawall failing at some point, not too far in the future. But other than that, the park, as I think I've been quoted on a few times, functions fairly well. We don't have other known issues that are immediate failures. This plan was set to set up to create a vision for the long term and allow us to budget for those resources, which currently are not, nothing in the capital improvement program is sufficient to cover even one specific aspect of the plan as you see tonight. Let's see, that's all I have. But there is obviously the fourth option. You could refer it. I just want to go through that one, I guess. You could refer it to next month. What I'm saying is, I don't feel comfortable allocating staff resources, so you're probably going to get most of my planning work, which is not high quality. I will do everything I can, but I don't have resources to pay consultants, and I don't really feel comfortable taking Sarah off projects, Brittingham dog park improvements, Reynolds lighting improvements, and other projects that we committed to getting done this year to take another kick at this one. So that's kind of how I see it. Certainly there's a variety of pathways from there to talk about tonight, policy board, and go from there. One I think is to approve the plan as presented, or mostly presented. The second one is to approve the plan with modifications to the plan, either language, requirements, conditions, actual map changes. That one I don't think textually is a big concern. The big concern I have is if we do start moving multitude of boxes, there's no way the staff can accurately reflect the commission's wishes if we're moving a bunch of things and consider it adopted and vetted in public. And that's where I'm uncomfortable. But certainly, as an example of something I'm sure we'll hear about tonight, if the commission said that center parking lot has to go, right, remove it. Well, I think staff is capable of going in and removing the parking lot and having a plan that is done at that point. But if it was moving it here, does that make sense? I don't know if it does. But and other restrictions, policy considerations can certainly be part of the plan. Modifications are under that modifications level.
My name is Sarah Lerner. I'm a landscape architect from Madison Parks. And I'm here today to present the revised James Madison Park Master Plan. And these changes are based on input we received and discussion at the Board of Park Commissioners meeting last month. And I will also be providing additional information on several questions that have been raised regarding the project. So, the option that is presented tonight is a revision to parking option 2 that was presented to the board last month. The plans presented in December and January kept the same number of stalls that currently exist. Parking option 2 that was presented last month redistributed the existing stalls to increase parking behind Gates of Heaven and at the existing northbound parking lot, while still providing parking access in the central activity area for Mendota rowing, for the park shelter, for the beach, boat ramps, etc. The plan presented today makes refinements to further increase the amount of green space, to reduce total pavement, to address concerns regarding views, and to preserve trees. This plan includes 13 spaces behind Gates of Heaven, 9 spaces off of East Gorham near the park shelter and central activity area, and expands the existing parking stalls, which there are 8, off of North Blount to add 4 additional spaces. The western half of this park includes 6 primary modifications. The first modification is that the basketball courts and volleyball court shifted northeast 50 feet, and this provides about 10,000 square feet more lawn. The second modification removes the loading zone from behind Gates of Heaven and makes it a drop-off from East Court, and that removes pavement within the park. That design also reconfigures the accessible stall locations based on input from Access to Independence. The third change shifts the lakefront path slightly closer to the lake to increase the amount of lawn in the large open area. The fourth modification removes a section of the internal park path that ran parallel to the sidewalk to increase the amount of lawn and decrease the amount of pavement. The fifth change adds bioinfiltration basins with native plantings to frame the proposed parking lot, making it a green infrastructure feature integrated into the environment. And the sixth change is to consolidate the volleyball court and play area in the same space, which is large enough for both activities. On the eastern half of the park, parking option 2 presented last month expanded the existing northbound parking lot to reduce the number of parking spaces in the lot off of East Gorham. The existing parking lot on northbound currently has 8 stalls, no accessible parking, and has existing stormwater inlets that collect runoff from the parking lot, just discharging stormwater directly into Lake Mendota without treatment. This plan expands this parking by 4 stalls, improves traffic flow, eliminating the current dead-end configuration, adds an overlook, and adds a bioinfiltration basin to treat the parking lot stormwater prior to entering Lake Mendota. The location for the historic house has been removed based on feedback we received from the Park Commission. So at this time, I would like to briefly provide some additional information regarding trees, views, the amount of paving and green space, and the planning documents that support this design, due to questions that have been specifically raised on these topics. So, regarding trees, identifying trees that will be removed at the master planning stage is difficult because much of that is refined during design development. And some trees may no longer exist by the time we implement the design. However, of the 150 trees that we surveyed as part of this project, this plan identifies 12 that are in conflict with the master plan. This is a reduction from the December plan that showed 16 trees in conflict with the master plan. As park planners and landscape architects, our goal is to preserve trees. At times when we have to make tough decisions on tree loss, we prioritize saving healthy, resilient, and non-invasive species. 8 of the 12 trees that conflict with the master plan are either invasive, ash, or are in poor condition. None of the trees impacted are in good health. So now I want to briefly talk about views. We heard a lot of concerns about views, and I wanted to show you that the majority of the views along East Gorham will be preserved. So here, I don't know if you can see the blue dot at the upper left corner of the blue arrow shows you where you are viewing down East Gorham. And these images are from Google Street View. So this is the northeasternmost start of James Madison Park. It shows the underground parking that is currently leased to Lincoln School on the park property. And then further down the street is Lincoln School, which is one of the residential properties that's on James Madison Park. That building is used by urban land interests and has about 28 apartments. So views in this area will not change. Next to the Lincoln School, and also within James Madison Park, is the historic William and Dora Collins House. This building was sold to a private entity in 2012 and is now operated as the Mendota Lake House Bed and Breakfast. The master plan does not propose any changes in this area. Next to the B&B is the existing North Mount Street parking lot. The existing lot has a small cul-de-sac before the drive down back to the Lincoln School apartments. The existing cul-de-sac doesn't have the appropriate turning radii for cars, and there's an inlet, as I mentioned before, at the end that discharges stormwater from this lot into Lake Mendota without treating it. The master plan would add 4 stalls to the existing 8 stalls, include an accessible space and access aisle to the adjacent to the proposed overlook, and treat stormwater runoff that is currently not being treated. We looked at providing additional parking spaces in this area due to feedback we received from the Board of Park Commissioners, and were unable to expand the lot further without significant grading or adding retaining walls. Right past this parking lot are 2 historic buildings sold in 2012 to private owners that lease the parkland under and around the buildings. The one closest to us in the photo is the Anna and Cornelius Collins house, which is now a multifamily apartment building. The one adjacent to that building is the Irene and Robert Connors house, and it's a single-family home. And there are no proposed changes to the buildings or leased land in the master plan in this area. Past these 2 buildings, the view overlooks Bernard Hoover Boathouse. The master plan proposes this space as preserved green space that remains unchanged. A few feet further downhill on East Gorham is the existing park shelter. The existing park shelter has a rooftop garden and 2 large towers that block views across the lake. proposed plan would remove this existing shelter and the towers that block the views. The new park shelter would incorporate community exhibition gardens, overlooks, potential green roof, public seating, and event space that overlooks the park and Lake Elizabeth. And just to note, I don't know if you can see, there's yellow dashed trees in the forefront. Those are street trees that we just outlined them because you wouldn't really see anything if you put the street trees in there. And then another note is that the trees that we use in these 3D modeling, we're somewhat limited in what we have for options, so they don't exactly reflect the existing conditions of that tree. So past the park shelter, we are now starting to look onto the central activity area. This view currently overlooks the volleyball court, the beach, and an asphalt access drive to the existing park shelter. In this area, the master plan proposes an expanded beach and similar maintenance drive. And in this view, we are approaching the Blair Street intersection, which has the off-street parking. So here we are at the Blair Street intersection where we currently have an access drive. This becomes the western end of the proposed parking lot. In this area, the master plan proposes a play area, basketball courts, volleyball court, and parking. This was a conscious decision to improve experiences, access, and consolidate active use within the park. The view will be different, but it still preserves the view of open space by lowering the parking area. So this is past the Blair Street intersection, approaching the Franklin Street intersection. This is where the 9 parking stalls will be located to support the park shelter and central activity area. Past the Franklin Street intersection, the view remains similar to what it is today, minus Bucky Badger, and keeps this area as an open, flexible lawn space for multiple uses. This view is at the intersection of Hamilton and Hancock and East Gorham. This is preserved lawn from the previous slide. Continues and will only be interrupted by an accessible path leading to the lakefront and an enhanced gathering area near Gates of Heaven. Here again is the existing view at the intersection of Hancock and Hamilton. This view will primarily be the same with preserved lawn. So in the master plan, green space is still the largest component of the park, but this plan does increase areas that are not vegetation. The beach expands, the playground expands, the park shelter is larger, and we have added overlooks and fishing access points at key locations. Additionally, this plan reduces the amount of lawn so that wetlands and native plants can be established. In this master plan, paving does increase. Paved areas increase as parking stalls are redistributed in a way to improve opportunities for all park users. Additionally, paved areas are increased to provide ADA access aisles and paved paths to recreational amenities as required by the United States ADA Access Board and which do not currently exist on site. This additional paving is offset by extensive stormwater management features. The master plan incorporates best management practices to reduce stormwater runoff from paved surfaces. It increases groundwater infiltration of stormwater and captures and treats stormwater runoff prior to entering Lake Mendota. The current site has no pervious pavement and 1 bioinfiltration basin. This proposed plan incorporates 10 bioinfiltration basins and pervious pavement. So the existing parking lot behind Gates of Heaven currently serves as the main parking area for that building and the park. Gates of Heaven can accommodate 98 people and has over 150 annual reservations. The existing park shelter can accommodate 60 people, which is the second smallest capacity of our reservable park shelters. And while not our least reserved facility, the Park and Open Space Plan identifies that it was reserved about 1/3 of the amount of Gates of Heaven. So when Madison Parks rebuilds the shelter, we hope a new shelter would be as successful as Gates of Heaven, and possibly more. We have been and will continue to review on-street parking opportunities to offset the need for off-street parking. However, without providing at least some off-street parking to support the new shelter and other activities, and provide critical ADA parking access to these areas, that would mean the entire burden for this parking area would shift into the neighborhood. So I want to talk briefly about this master plan's goals in relationship to citywide goals and supporting plans. Both the City of Madison Comprehensive Plan and Park and Open Space Plan were developed with the 4 guiding lenses that are likely our city's most challenging issues. The first of these lenses is equity, and ensuring that Madison grows in an equitable and intentional way to support those who are most burdened. We have to ensure that our actions do not unintentionally prevent others from access. The second lens is public health, which ties closely with equity, guaranteeing that all populations have opportunities to engage in physical activities that promote positive health outcomes. The last 2 related lenses of sustainability and adaptability reflect not only our ability to respond and adapt to changing environmental pressures, but also to be adaptable to economic and cultural shifts and create a fiscally sustainable system. These 4 lenses and their recommendations in many of our regional plans respond to our knowledge that Madison is growing. This means looking at our growth and park uses in a proactive, different way than we have in the past. This means making spaces more inclusive, like providing required ADA paths and incorporating recommendations that we hear from historically underrepresented groups. This means adding bioinfiltration basins, reducing lawn, and increasing native habitat to try to mitigate environmental impacts. And this also means providing more varying types of activities and recreational spaces that may change what this looks like in the surrounding neighborhood. With the adoption of the Park and Open Space Plan, this plan and future master planning efforts will likely face similar competing interests. It's important to try to find balance, but also recognize that in order to lessen the core disparities in Madison and changing environmental conditions, we have to be on the forefront of making those intentional changes. This plan is the first master plan to be developed since the recommendations of the Park and Open Space Plan. So this plan is completed in accordance with a statement of policy and guidelines for master plan activities to ensure that park master plans are consistent with the City of Madison Park and Open Space Plan to enhance equity, public health, sustainability, and adaptability for our entire park system and residents. I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. Yeah.
Any questions for Sarah? Sarah, the first slide you had this dated plan with the numbers on it, the west side of the market. Can you flip back to that and just, when you describe number 6, slip the slide right behind.
Sarah, could you repeat the questions because it's hard to hear?
I'm sorry.
Emily wanted to see the slide with the number of parking spots identified for each area, which is like the second slide, so sorry, gotta go back.
Yeah.
Oh, right here? This one?
Back.
That one?
This one.
One more?
No, I wanted to see the one with the black numbers. With the, I just wanted to understand this emphasizes the changes since the last time we looked at it. And I wanted
Yeah,
to
and it's harder to see the red lines on this version. So previously, the courts were kind of over here. We had the volleyball court, so there's a red dash line here. You probably can't see from there. This is shifted this way. 2 is that this used to be back here when you saw the meeting last month. And Alder Zeller was actually already working on getting a loading zone spot here. So we were able to kind of shift this pavement and make it smaller, open up this open space. The third one is we had this path bowed out. We just brought it a little bit closer to the shoreline. And then we had a parallel path running to the sidewalk. So we removed that, added a bioinfiltration basin, and then this is the area we wanted to make sure it was a volleyball court and a play area.
So that'll have a playground and a pit for.
Yeah, it's labeled on the master plan that is the paper version.
Yep.
And you shifted the court, the basketball courts, just to improve the view shed a bit?
Yeah, we're hoping that we could improve the view shed. You really only have one area that was kind of consolidated, that was interrupted, and then we could expand the lawn area. You know, that was a concern people had.
the case with the Wild Warner speaker earlier tonight, that we have 3 minutes per person. First here is Emily Reynolds at 303 North Hamilton Street, opposes and does wish to speak. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Hi. I'm opposed with an asterisk. So first I want to acknowledge the excellent work that the designers did, listening to public comments and making revisions. But I do still want to talk about the central parking lot. I read most of the public comments that were included in the materials for tonight. I hope you guys did too, I assume so. And I'm sure you noticed that the vast majority are against the central parking lot. But the ones who want to retain parking are those who use Gates of Heaven. And so I do agree that our Jewish community should continue to have parking available to them, which I'm sure Eric will be happy to hear means his staff don't need to do anything. There's already a parking lot there. But I wanted to say that, a lot of talk was done just now about equity and about increasing access to the parks. But that central parking lot, as we heard during an earlier agenda item, those mainly help to serve those who have rented out the shelter to use for weddings. And so what you're doing is creating space for our wealthiest individuals in Madison to use the park in the way that they want to. And I do know that that funding helps support the parks. I think that our cities should be in the business of supporting parks without wealthy individuals having to supplement it. So I just wanted to make that point. I don't drive. I take public transportation everywhere, and it's excellent in Madison, particularly downtown. So folks can use public transportation, but yes, of course, there needs to be ADA parking available as well. It just doesn't need to be for people who can get there in by other ways. I think that's less than 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
Next is Donna Crowley of 646 East Gorham, opposes and does wish to speak. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you. I'm an architect, resident of one of the homes in the park, and I was asked by Parks to be part of the stakeholder in this process.
Could you speak up a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you. I have several questions and only 2 plan changes. My first concern is with the gaps of information that are being provided to the public. I've provided this previously. Provide the public with the RFP required cost estimates, preliminary lighting plan. Costs sounded to be the reason to exclude study of the West Shelter. I ask that the work product of the $18,000 design change order staff stated was due to my comments be presented. I have not seen those elements. I estimate the design team is only 60% complete with the scope of the RFP. Please provide the written DNR preliminary approval. Park staff indicates the emergent wetland will be difficult to permit. How will it be possible? How can we make that a 2020 budget request today for the stormwater management portion? My largest concern is the needless sacrifice of green space. Strive to meet the city's shoreline park preservation ordinance, which sets the bar for buildings and paved areas to be no more than 5% of a shoreline park. Excluding pass and ground leases, that translates to 25,000 square feet roughly. This plan continues to double the amount of paved parking area. The Blount Street alone converts over 5,000 square feet of green space for 4 stalls. We've already had traffic engineering agree to the opportunity for increased parking on Blount Street. Those 4 stalls can be provided on Blount Street at 0 cost to the project, to traffic engineering. That's my first request. Put the Blount Street on the street. My second request, when you relocate the shelter to the west, it is universally accessible and that center parking lot moves with it. It preserves green space, designated views, it's safe, it connects the community with nature, it supports Gates of Heaven and doesn't compete with it by wrapping Gates of Heaven with a natural context. It provides the septet criteria for all entrances to face the street. This doesn't sacrifice any public use request. It celebrates every request at this park. It does not sacrifice comp plan designated views. That's not on the table for negotiation. Access for Independence, which I learned this week is a paid consultant on the team who spoke as a part of the public testimony. They recommended that we designate a few ADA street spots because street spots are more efficient use of space than ADA parking lot stalls. They also stated that stable surfaces do not have to be concrete. This is a missed opportunity. With those two changes, it really would make a substantial shift in celebrating the space, maintaining the views. The view will be blocked. There are meeting minutes that state the shelter will block views. There's an elevator tower. So please consider those.
Appreciate you coming out.
And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. John Jacobs of 2630 Kendall Avenue opposes and does wish to speak. Thank you.
I wasn't able to get the stuff, sorry, I wanted to. So the first one is, you don't need to read it today. It's basically the complaining about last time. And the second one
Could you
is
speak in the microphone, please, so we can all hear?
the second one is my comments from last time, which I wasn't able to complete. And what I didn't get done last time was the planned shelter is way too large for its location at the narrowest part of the park. At 3 times the size of the existing shelter, and with its roof extending farther towards the lake, the new building will block views far more than the existing shelter. Like the big tubes that currently block part of the view, the mass of the new structures on the roof, including an unnecessary extra roof, a fake green roof with interpretive walkway, an elevator, and then trees to hide the elevator, to block the view far more than the tubes, which are already mentioned in the plan as being objectionably blocking the view. Because the shelter was moved, that huge shelter, sorry, I gotta get away from the microphone for just a second. The old one is here. This thing is huge. The huge shelter, moving it west into the green space further reduces the area for active recreation. I can't do everything I want, but what I'd like the commission to do is ask, where the heck is the volleyball court? They say that it's in the same place that the playground was before. How can you put, if you look at the plans before and the plans now, the same exact thing where that number 6 is, they had the playground there. Now they got the playground and the volleyball courts. If they were actually going to put it there, where is it? And why didn't they put it there? I think this goes along with the red-green dots charade you guys had last time, where they said green is good, and they didn't tell you that the next meeting, those dots turned into red dots. You've got an honesty problem here. Where is the volleyball court? Why wasn't it drawn in? And if they can't give you something straight, something honest, don't approve the plan. I recommend you table it. I'm sorry. I will help get funding with my alder, if I can in the future, table this sucker. Block the views way too much with the shelter, with the huge elevator on the roof. Why do we need an elevator on a shelter in this precious park, the narrowest part of the park? Why is the shelter so large? That's the question. And where is the volleyball?
Thank you for coming out. Abigail Barnes of 646 East Gorham opposes and wishes to speak.
Hi, thank you all. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. My name is Abigail Barnes. I'm an attorney and I have a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry. I'm a resident of one of the grandfathered homes in the park, and I'm a daily park goer. I routinely use the bike lane on Gorham. I'm the founder and CEO of a local startup and the author of the December 11th business article titled From Park to Parking Lot. In the week following the publication of this business piece, your committee received roughly 130 comments. Of those, nearly all opposed the new parking design and any net increase in concrete. Of the 150 total comments, I found fewer than 10 that supported the proposed parking. I spent several hours today combing through them. I hope you've read them all. 146 pages of those comments, the city divided those into 6 attachments. Conveniently, all of the ones that support the parking are in the first attachment. So there are several glaring issues I see with the current design, but I'll speak to the two most troubling. First is the lack of transparency and misinformation that has mired this process. Many of the stats presented to this committee on public engagement were misleading or otherwise distorted the degree of substantive public input. The second issue is the reason for the additional parking. First, the public was told we needed to move the parking lot for safety reasons and invoked a crime prevention through environmental design rationale. After a member of the stakeholder committee pointed out that the city's figure on police calls was incorrect and that the 700 figure was actually closer to 40, the narrative changed to the res due process demanded for it. After the team could not point to where in the docket the res due process called for this new parking, the narrative now appears to be predominantly convenience. Moving the parking lot and centralizing activities will be more convenient for parkgoers and rollers. Convenience. Never mind that you lose the volleyball court. 14,000 square feet of green space is converted to additional concrete. 400 feet of view sheds lost and about a dozen trees. You'll have convenience instead. In the years I've lived next to the park, I have never seen both parking lots at capacity or a lack of parking at Gorham, even on weekends in the summer. There are currently 90 parking spots between Gorham, Blount, and Butler Street that touch the park, with no hourly limit on evenings and weekends. No hourly limit. This is one of several pieces of misinformation that has been misrepresented to the public, specifically in Alder Liddell Zeller's December 7th letter of support. I strongly encourage this community to stand with the public and reject this version of the master plan and any other version that needlessly doubles the amount of concrete in James Madison Park. I'm happy to come back here to answer any questions or provide further clarification on my remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Perry Sandstrom of 3520 Gregory Street, Madison, opposes and wishes to speak.
Hi, thanks. So a lot of my concerns mirror some of the ones I just heard here. And I think just in general, the new shelter repeats the same mistakes as this view block, as the silos in the old shelter. And it does so even more completely. And I think this is really obvious just by looking at the plan. And I think the city of John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Jens Jensen, and Frank Lloyd Wright can presumably do better in its namesake park than a building that actually looks, unfortunately, quite a bit like a lot of the commercial mixed-use developments that happen. I mean, I think we should really shoot for something very special. And I realize that these could be fluid plan items, but a lot of this plan hinges on having that shelter exactly where it is right now. And that's why the parking is now moved in, and no one likes that. I think if one were to consider the fact that the Gates of Heaven facility right now, as far as I understand with this plan, would require basically porta potties to have an ADA accessible facility near that. I think that the plan, a plan that has at least restrooms, if not the shelter on the west side, would much better accommodate people that were using the Gates of Heaven facility. And that's a valuable city facility that should be supported instead of just kind of sidelined because of the new thing going on the other end. One of the bigger concerns I also have is that you'll be introducing a new significant hazard to cyclists by having active parking lot at what was just called the Blair Street entrance, I think. That's actually, you can't tell from the map here, but that's on a downhill slope that is one of the most fun coasting things on a bicycle in Madison. I used to live right around there and do it every morning. And it was challenging a little bit. You had to make sure that there was nobody sitting in the passenger seat of cars so you didn't get doored. But you didn't have to worry about traffic turning in front of you. Now that is no longer the case. And I think it is actually inevitable that someone would be injured by coasting down this hill high speed and then having like traffic coming in and out right in the middle of one of the steeper slopes in Madison and highly trafficked. So anyhow, that's about all I have. But in summary, I think if you take your oversight role seriously, you should do the option 3 that Mr. Knapp suggested, and at least table this and use the already good ideas that have been generated and the modifications, which, you know, are, I think, significant in the positive, right direction, but still not quite there.
Thank you for coming out. David Zappo of 944 East Mifflin Street. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He opposes and wishes to speak. David?
Hello, you did pronounce it correctly. I hope you all forgive my attire. I've been traveling the last few days. I just got done shoveling the driveway. I came out last time to oppose the changes to the plan. I appreciate all the work that the consultants have put in. I know it's not easy to receive all this criticism. I know everyone's worked hard on this. But I don't think the design is appropriate for approval. You know, I remember hearing Mr. Knapp speak back when Bree Stevens, Big Top, was looking to renew its contract over there. And there was a lot of outcry and sort of resistance from some parts of the neighborhood about the noise and the disruption and this and that. And I think Mr. Knapp made a good point, and I think it's been made tonight, that when you're conducting planning like this, you have to make value-based judgments, you have to balance competing interests, and you have to arrive at a solution that's going to accommodate those competing interests, and it's going to appropriately balance those interests. And I don't think the current plan does that. I don't think I mean, the existing shelter is hideous, for sure. Stormwater filtration, I think everyone can agree that's a good thing. I think everyone can agree improving access for the disabled is an important objective. But I think the existing plan tries to do too much to a good thing. There's simply no, I go and play basketball at those courts every summer for the last 3 years. I've never heard anyone complain about the location. Never heard anyone complain about the parking. I don't see any reason to move them, frankly, to move that much pay space, to move a parking lot from the west end of the park right into the middle. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I don't think this commission should approve it. I think y'all should table this, and more work needs to be done. So thank you for hearing me.
Thank you for coming out. Dennis Magito, I'm not sure. Thank you. 4236
4230 Mandan Crescent.
Mandan Crescent. Thank you. Opposes and wishes to speak.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm probably the only person here who was around when the first James Madison Park plan was developed, proposed and developed. Anybody here at that time? Okay, so I was here. In fact, my house was right in the middle of the volleyball courts, or proposed basketball courts. And my house was condemned to make room for James Madison Park. And frankly, that pissed me off. And so I ran for the city council against the incumbent, in part on that platform. And I beat him. They called me Landslide McGilligan. I won by 67 votes. Smallest margin in the city history. Next time I ran, I got 99 votes. And the third time I ran, I had a plurality of 750. Anyhow, my point is that I feel strongly about James Madison Park. I grew up when it was Conklin Park. I played basketball on the old basketball court before they improved the courts. I vigorously opposed moving the gates of Heaven Synagogue into James Madison Park for the simple reason that they tore down a lot of houses with people living there, part of a community, to build a park through condemnation. And I was against that. And so I really didn't like to see the gates of Heaven Synagogue go there, but finally I came around and said it was okay. And I approved it and I supported it. So why am I saying all this? I agree with what everybody has said tonight. I think they made some really good points. When I grew up, it was Conklin Park, the big open space that people are fighting for. We played baseball there. We had hockey games in the neighborhood. And you had a view of the lake that is precious and needs to be preserved. I think people deserve to be heard who have spoken tonight. I think the plan should be rejected. I'm not sure that, I think the main point that was made earlier is a good point. The park is functional as it is. It's well used, and people use it and enjoy it, and it doesn't really need much improvement. But if you are going to improve it, listen to the people who live in the neighborhood and try to incorporate their concerns into the master plan. You've made some improvements since you got concerns expressed in December and January, but still, from what I can tell, it's not really a good plan. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. Thank you for the history lesson. Really haven't heard that. I think before we start, oh, I beg your pardon. Alder Zellers, would you like to speak at this point?
I think I'll wait until, probably you're going to have questions of our consultants. I think I'll wait until after that conversation has taken place.
So before we start discussing this, I think it would be helpful to have a motion on the table that gets us started. Is that possible?
I move approval.
Is there a second? I'll second. Emily moves approval, Moira seconds. What kinds of questions do we have on what we heard tonight? I have, I would like to see a modification in the sentence that was added on page 45 regarding parking. Possible modifications to street parking adjacent to the park continues to be explored to provide alternate options for additional parking. I would prefer that it say for off-street parking. These will be maximized to the extent possible. That's an addition in this, and I appreciate it. I think it reflects the fact that this is a plan. It's not being built in the next 6 months.
Additional off-street parking?
Simply for off-street parking. Drop additional and replace it with off-street. Is that an acceptable? Meaning, I think that makes sense. I think that as a master plan, these are not building plans, these are not specifically funded. I think that each of the parking areas inside the park are planned as feasible options, but I think that as you start to put pen to paper.
Could you use the microphone,
Oh, I'm
please?
so sorry.
Thank you.
Although I'm not sure this works.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Sarah. My comment was that I think that Madeline's modification makes sense, and I think that as a general matter, a master plan is a directional, feasible document. It's not a building plan that someone intends to use to go pour concrete next week. And so before we get to the place where we're ready to bid out building plans, there are options to, again, consider and wrestle with what the different needs assessment and specific plan might be. So I do think that it's a fair comment on the, I think the Flound Street lot, that there's a lot of additional pavement for only 4 spots, and that you know, your graph presented, these are the trade-offs that we've made from the existing park to the planned park, and I think that's super helpful, and I think as policymakers that's helpful to us because those are trade-offs that we want to make sure we're considering. In that parking lot, that might be something, that might be too much of a trade-off to just get 4 spaces and maybe maybe that's not, at the time we get ready to pour something, maybe that's not what we want to do.
So we've had plenty of conversation about the parking, and I think if you sort of put out of your mind if you just look at this image by itself, you'd say, man, there's a lot of green space here. But I wonder, do we have any sort of comparables or any sort of ratios that we use as guides for how much parking does the Parks Department see as ideal as a sort of ratio to green space, or in a community park of this size or scale, do we have comparables from other communities? Like what's an appropriate amount?
So we don't have, usually a lot of zoning code requirements that require a certain number of stalls for whatever the use that is. Zoning code currently doesn't have that. What I can tell you is we've looked at parking at Brittingham, at Tenney, at Law, Burroughs, other lakefront community parks, and they have, Tenney probably has, I think, over 100 stalls, maybe Ulrich as well. They're really large because it's a community park with, we hope, destination events. So while we don't have a standard of parking to green space, this is significantly smaller. It is a smaller parcel, it's more narrow too, so we have limitations there, but it's much smaller than we typically have at some of our lakefront community parks. We only have a few of those, and not everyone can walk to the parks.
To follow up on that, we all also know that this is a couple blocks from the square. There's plenty of community, there's plenty of parking that exists within proximity.
Yep.
Can you speak a little bit about how you factor that in?
Well, I'm going to talk about one aspect and have Zia talk about the community engagement aspect and what we heard from the focus groups.
Thank you.
The first aspect is the neighborhood is, and I want to acknowledge that they're completely correct when we talk about the off-street parking spaces that are no time limits on the weekends, and I think it's also the evenings as well. During the weekday, it's 2-hour residential parking. So there's parking spaces available. It's limited to 2 hours. So if you're going back to go kayak, you have to be back every 2 hours to move your car. What we heard from traffic engineering is that they wanted off-street parking in this facility because their concern is that in this neighborhood, there is a high demand for on-street parking within the residential capacity. And I think their larger concern is that Madison's isthmus is increasing in density. There's going to be more competing use for residential on-street parking. And we're putting in a facility that, right now it may function fairly well because there's about 1/3 of the reservations and it's much smaller. But if we're putting in a facility at a community park that we want really people to attend, we want it to be as successful as Gates of Heaven, that's 3 times as many reservations. So it's adding more demand for the on-street parking. So that was, traffic engineering's request that we also have off-street parking. So what we tried to do was, rather than adding an additional parking, was to redistribute it so it would function better from what we heard from the focus groups. And Zia, if you wanted to come on down.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. As Sarah mentioned, this whole process was designed originally to really focus on engaging a lot of diverse voices. And I think probably, there were many different engagement tools that we used. Probably the strongest one that really got to the highest concentration of diversity was the focus groups. We had 6 of those. We met with mothers at the YWCA. We met and talked with people at the Beacon Homeless Day Resource Center. We talked with a number of minority community organizations just in Greater Madison. And I think what was particularly telling was that every single one of those focus groups, with the exception of the people utilizing the beacon, said that parking was something that, they mentioned it as a current dislike of the park, that there's not enough, it's not really well configured, the relationship of the parking to the shelter, and then to other pieces, like, at the YWC, they talked a lot about parking near the playground and the shelter. So both of those are pretty, divorced right now at James Madison Park. So, it was a demand that we heard from groups of people who really, that was our touch point with them. These are folks who are not showing up at the public meetings, really who are not responding even to the survey, and the Intercept interviews, Marcus was a part of doing those. But, that was the highest concentration of those typically underrepresented populations that we spoke with. And so, and that was very clearly represented among all of them.
So can you clarify what they did with the parking gates? It was the existing, was there concerns about safety?
Well, I think the parking at gates, there were maybe some concerns about safety, but it was just that there wasn't enough and it's not well configured. So if you're trying, there was a lot of talk about the shelter, if you're trying to get to the shelter, then from a disability perspective, or if you have kids, or, whatever, you're lugging stuff, it's just not really well organized. So, those were the two biggest pieces. It's hard to find parking and it's not well organized.
Hello? So, it was acknowledged at some point that the SIP doesn't actually call for any of this work. So this is a, what? Sorry. The SIP doesn't call for anything on the scale of this level of project, to be more specific. I'm sorry. The 5-year capital plan. So, as we anticipate, maybe a council or mayor prioritizing this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I guess the challenge of doing planning projects like this is that we also have to try to think about how does the future work, right? So one of the things that will be hopefully more present and more prominent and more available in the future is better access to public transportation, more frequent public transportation, possibly bus rapid transit or something similar. Is anybody involved in the planning process? Can anybody speak to how do we think about the future of transportation as it relates to the present need and present demand for parking? Or is that just, is that something that we can't, because we don't know what the future holds, we can't quite factor it in, and so we plan for the present?
Well, Zia, are you involved?
You're asking about the planning process for BRT? Or
No,
just in general?
For demand for cars, demand for parking,
Yeah.
and whether or not we think it will change in the future.
I mean, yeah, maybe from there.
I would say.
Future, go.
We are involved in the BRT planning process as well, but I think, this topic has come up in a number of projects that we've been working on, including this one. And it really is a black box. I mean, we don't know for sure, right? We know that, we know and we hope that it will continue in this way, that Madison is investing in public transit. Madison is thinking really progressively about all of our transportation options and recognizing that personal vehicles are not a solution in the future, and we want to be getting people away from those. But there also is a recognition that likely, whether there's autonomous vehicles or who knows what Uber and Lyft are going to be doing with their changing business models. And, we don't think that autonomous vehicles will not exist in the future. There will be a modal future. And so we just really can't anticipate, and like I think a few people have said already, that, this is a master plan, and if it's up in 6 or 7 or 8 years for funding, and it looks like, we've got a BRT system, the first line implemented, and the next one is moving forward, and, maybe we can start reducing parking, by half in some of these developments and planning projects. And that's something that can be done. This is a master plan, and so it's flexible in that way. But I think there's a recognition that we can't not be planning for really any mode at this point. So that's what I would say.
I didn't know Ken wanted to. Yeah. So that you, while Ken's thinking about it, I think it's a really good question. I think it's a challenge for the city in sum total, because certainly there's a recognition. If you talk about the SIP is a good recognition of the city's focus on multimodal future. We invest very heavily in bikes and bicycle access and paths, and including transportation projects. The transit budget, the 2019 now SIP is very significant. I mean, if people haven't put the pieces together, the Northeast Green Space Park project was eliminated from the SIP, right? And the funding essentially is at a bus barn. I mean, the city's committed to it, and I think it's important that we do, certainly, but how do we plan for that future with park plans? I think the best we can do is look at plans from a vision and value standpoint of what they're trying to signal a little bit, and then don't do silly things later. I talked about earlier, tennis courts. We have, I believe it's 9, it might be 12 parks that are supposed to have tennis courts. In fact, my neighborhood park's supposed to have a volleyball court on the master plan, and we haven't built it because it's really not the demand. It's kind of a dated figment of the time, and you kind of have to evolve your standard. And all I can say is, from my chair, as long as I'm in it, the idea of building unnecessary parking lots is extremely low priority. Parking lots are incredibly expensive. They're not environmentally friendly. I've never made the argument they are. That said, this commission knows as well that in the current context, the current mode share we see, not providing parking, we often hear about parking here on the other side of the equation. For those who are calling back to the beer garden conversations, even though that beach parking lot, which has a tennis court and a basketball court beside it, and a beach, right? No reservable shelter, no gates of heaven, has, I believe, 84 stalls. That one lot, there's more across the street, there's more down the street, there's more here. This park has over 380, not including gardens. You have lake access, beach, Lakeland Avenue. And if you recall, when we actually, now, do I think it was all about parking? No, I do not. But during the beer garden conversations, a big concern was there's going to be parking overflow in the neighborhood because of the new use. And one of my biggest concerns is this park, if we're going to invest in it, needs to be invested in wisely to promote diversity of use for a rapidly urbanizing urban center. This is one of 2, maybe 3 if you count Law, which has got its challenges that we're going to work on. Kind of lakefront downtown parks to serve a growing number of folks. And so for BMO, I think we need to be very cautious about moving forward with any kind of new parking lot constructions, and we need to be monitoring the situation. I don't know how to assure the community or the commission that we ought to be pumping the brakes before we're building new parking lots in the future, because this is an evolving landscape. And certainly, I think that's a fair level of scrutiny and kind of follow through on any of our plans related to parking. My hope in Oberg, as an example, is we can shrink parking over the next 2 decades, right? Now, not necessarily the gardens, but if we do get some load share, if Atwood Avenue service continues, maybe we can shrink those lots a little bit. We actually shrunk the lot at Tinney Beach, for those who were around the commission at that time, just some consternation about the shrinking. What I've learned over time too is parking is going to be controversial. I don't think there's a perfect answer. I think we should really talk about how to be thoughtful and approach the future from a policy-driven perspective. And that's where I look to you guys to kind of lead us on what ought we to be thinking about. But bad non-answer, but that's kind of just stream of consciousness.
Those two sort of helpful answers to a somewhat inarticulate question, so thank you. I guess just to follow up on, I mean, from my perspective, I would like to live in the Family Matters Steve Urkel version of the world where you can teleport yourself to wherever you want to be, right? Like, and in a plan where we know that this might not happen for closer to 10 years than 2. From a policymaker perspective, I am interested in having, I guess, in making it known that parking's not, by the time we come back to this, hopefully we can have some sort of justification for what parking ought to be in that moment in time, whether that's 2025 or 2035. Like the world will quite likely be different. So hopefully as Madison continues to grow, as we're going to add another 3,000 people any given year for the next 10 years, for the next 20 years, the way that people are going to, by necessity, move about our city is going to continue to change. And I guess I don't know how to put that in the form of I don't have thoughts yet about how to put that in the form of language that would accompany this, but that's my sort of desire that I'd like to figure out how to articulate.
I think this is helpful discussion because I do think that in the future there will be less demand for parking than there is today. But I also think that the demand for parking today in an area like James Madison Park exceeds the supply of parking. So I think there's it's a dynamic equation. So I think Madeline's comment, this comment at the bottom of page 45, possible modifications to street parking adjacent to the park continues to be explored to provide alternate options for off-street parking. These will be maximized to the extent possible. I mean that, we could certainly add another sentence that had guidance that said, before building new parking structures in the park, there should be further assessment, particularly as we get further into the future from 2019. I think you could, you guys will come up with more eloquent wording than that. But I think there are additional comments that we can make to say or to emphasize that we don't want to put down any more parking lots than are necessary to serve the needs of the park users. But I do think what we're being asked to do is to say that there should be handicap parking near the park community, near the park amenities, near the shelter, the playground, basketball courts, the overlooks, the beach. And today there is none of that. It's all 600 feet away. So that's anyway. That's my thought in response to your comment. I don't know if that helps with thinking.
And I thank you, Emily, for that, and thank you, Mo, for getting us started on this type of a conversation. And thanks to everybody in the room for raising these issues over and over again. This is clearly a well-loved park. I think we all in this room recognize that, and that's something that brings us to common ground. And to me, I said this last month during the meeting, but I see so many good things about this plan. The swimming area improvements are impressive. The emergent wetlands are something I feel enthusiastic about. I like the idea of how we're pulling some of these amenities to be responsive, if I recall, from particularly the YMCA families who want to have their playground and their volleyball and their basketball maybe a little bit more clustered. There's some very attractive things. Addressing the needs of the shelter, everyone agrees, I can't remember who said it tonight, but everyone agrees it's not an attractive place right now, and Sarah had some figures about usage. So I think it's great we're taking steps to address all these things. And by putting all these amenities, enhancing the existing amenities, let's put it that way, while maintaining a nice quality amount of green space, it just feels responsible that we do need to address the parking. And nobody here has a crystal ball. I think, I agree. I can't speak eloquently on what the future holds, what modal transportation will be, but we have to take a look at this in the here and now, and it doesn't feel responsible to address all these factors and not allow for parking. So Emily, I love, what kind of language we could add to say, this is a plan. And as implementation comes, let's take a look at that plan. What's changed in the larger world, and can we react to that? So we have a good summary other than to say, I have to tell myself it's a plan. Just my little anecdote is when I very, very first saw this plan, and I got very excited about the emergent wetland aspect, and I said, I know some great international coastal engineers who could come and give us some advice on putting in this wetland. And Eric was like, okay, step off the gas pedal for a minute there. We're not really getting ready to implement anything right now. So I have to remind myself and remind all of us that we're not pouring concrete, we're not staking out anything, we're not imminently doing anything for good and bad.
So do we, as far as additional amendments to page 45, I think just a comment to the effect that at the time of implementation, we would assess what the minimum required parking needs would be, so that we would only do the minimum parking surfaces in the park as necessary at the time. But, Eric, you have other comments?
I'm going to try. I think from a plain language perspective, it's where you want specific action. It's going to kind of call for it. And so I'm not sure that I necessarily grasp the specific action with the round bend. We'll get there, but I would encourage the language to be added of prior to the implementation. That's where I don't want to be squishy. I want to be kind of clear. The implementation of any of the new parking structures or any change in parking structure or any part of the plan. The reason I want to clarify that is as I said earlier, the number one thing that I have concern with, I think is rational, is the seawall failing. And I would really be scared of having the seawall fail and needing to move quickly, but if it is,
I meant prior to building new parking surfaces.
Moving any
in the
parking
park.
surfaces,
Yes.
okay. So in that case, I think, being prescriptive that prior to building, or prior to design development of new parking structures, and that way you're not getting any of the things that happen when people say, well, we started this work, right? We won't start any work designing, prior to design development of parking facilities. If you like, you could call it parking and paving facilities. It's all around. Like I said, I want specificity from the policymakers, but the parks division will secure approval from the Board of Park Commissioners of a parking demand study. and I don't know, that's actually got other connotations. I don't know, Liddell just winced, she knows more about development than I do. I don't know what that last word is, like parking, whatever, what you want. I just don't know how to describe it right now. I'm trying to formulate that in my head. Like a parking reduction strategy? Because I mean, honestly, I don't mind trying to find a way to reduce parking. It's not my favorite way, or any of our favorite ways to spend our limited resources. I'm just not certain on the wording. Wordsmithing on the floor is hard, but I'm happy to continue it. But I do think that prior to commencing design development is an important phrase. So there's nobody in me or future me or any, isn't going to read that and have any lack of clarity. It's pretty clear. Before you do anything, you better.
Yeah, I just think the comment might, or the missing word in there might be prior to design, development, of parking facilities, that we would seek to minimize the impact of new paved surfaces in the park. And if we wanted, I don't know that I want to bind future policymakers and say you have to approve a study, or what is the check for that? Is there a future approval process that you write into your master plan, or do you just put in guidance here that says, maximize alternate options, minimize the impact of parking structures in the park? That's kind of where, that's where I'm headed. I don't know if others have other words.
Can we say that's a motion?
Yes. You can sort of-
prefer to.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we can either make it or try to get the wording right, or the intent to be possible to designate our commission staff finalize, or try to finalize.
I would certainly prefer to finalize the language. We're already started the wordsmithing. We should. I think we can finish it, and I think that would help me because, like I said, I have no concerns about binding future staff of coming to commission to get approval of a specific item. We already go through project work. We have, our standard approach of project improvements now is there's always a public-facing component. I don't think everybody. I think a lot of folks in this room would be here to ask those questions at that time when it is implemented, because I think we're a little ways away. But so it's really that's a policymaker question, how you want to word that last part. I will rescind the traffic or parking demand is probably not the right way to put it, because I actually thinking about it, having looked at those before for a couple other locations, the number is going to come back pretty high based on the uses. So I would encourage us never asking the parking spots we should have.
So this is going to come back to this commission regardless. And so I do appreciate the suggestion that we sort of don't need to put in the hurdle of a specific plan or something like that. I think what we're trying to do is specify that when this does come back, this body in this day had a desire to minimize parking, right? I mean, that's really what we're trying to say. Did you make progress on language? I was buying you time.
I'm glad I brought a pen, yeah. So how about this, Eric? Prior to design development of parking facilities in the park, the master plan will minimize the new parking surfaces included in the park to the extent possible. We'll seek to minimize.
And you want to put something like responsive, contemporary. Broad enough. So take into account public transportation needs, use needs.
So prior to design development of, maybe we'll say, well, prior to design development of parking facilities in the park, the master plan, I don't know if it's the master plan, actor in this. The master plan will minimize the new surfaces in the park to the extent appropriate and responsive to contemporary conditions. It'd be the Parks Division rather than the master plan. All right, I'll try one more time. Prior to design development of parking facilities, the Parks Division will seek to minimize the new surfaces in the park to the extent appropriate and responsive to contemporary conditions.
So that's your motion?
Yes, so my motion would be to approve the master plan with that additional language added to page 45, along with Madeline's change of additional top streets. Right, prior to design development of parking facilities, the Parks Division will seek to minimize the new surfaces in the park to the extent appropriate and responsive to contemporary conditions.
Is there a second?
I second that.
Further discussion on this panel? All in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. Can we proceed without a recess?
I think so. I don't think this next part should take too long.
Is Vern here? Vern's here. Sorry,
Was that a vote on the amendment or the whole thing?
that was a vote on the motion to approve with modified language on page 45.
So it was, okay, okay.
Probably take a motion on
No,
it.
well, I mean,
I think what Madeline's saying is the amendment was considered friendly, but I'm not sure. The original mover.
You made the original motion.
Yeah, I made the original motion.
Made a friendly amendment to yourself.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's up to you guys. We definitely,
With
we
a large
got it.
pink down,
You got it.
that helps. So I think the motion as amended is what we did for.
that's okay. I mean,
Yes.
that's fine. I was gonna make a
No,
few
go
comments, but
Yeah,
that's good.
it-
Oh, we'll,
That's okay. I mean, that's fine. People have even already left, so.